The official narrative is deceptively simple. The Mandalorian Wars, we are told, were a brutal storm unleashed by warriors who worshipped conflict, and the Jedi Council's refusal to join the fighting is still described as a noble act of restraint. According to the archives, the Order held the moral high ground by refusing to descend to Mandalorian aggression. But history is not written in slogans. It is written in reports, memoranda, casualty projections, and the quiet decisions of people who chose inaction while entire sectors burned. When we examine those documents, the image of a principled, pacifist council collapses almost immediately. In a previous exhibit, we examined the destruction of Taris, a world often cited as evidence of Mandalorian savagery. The outer layers of the story blame the Mandalorians entirely, yet the archival record shows that Taris was identified in advance as a high-risk target, its vulnerability cataloged, its probable destruction weighed against the political comfort of the core. The bombardment was not a surprise. It was the predictable outcome of decisions made in distant chambers on Coruscant. The Council called this patience, a discipline of non-intervention, a refusal to be drawn into what they labeled a regional conflict until the situation became sufficiently inconvenient for the Republic's center of gravity. On the surface, this posture is still celebrated as moral clarity. In the documents we are about to examine, it reveals itself as something else entirely, a system of institutional cowardice disguised as serenity. This session will not rely on speculation. It will rely on the Council's own words, classified communications circulated between Coruscant and the Outer Rim, where senior Jedi described active genocides as fluid situations and recommended continued patience while populations were systematically erased. It was in this environment that one Jedi, Revan, stood at the intersection of two realities: the rhetoric of peace in the Council chambers and the reality of Mandalorian fire in the Outer Rim. To understand why Revan ultimately turned against the Order, we must first understand the architecture of the cowardice he was asked to obey. The word cowardice is a strong one. I use it deliberately, not as provocation, but as a diagnosis. During the Mandalorian Wars, the Jedi High Council demonstrated an elaborate bureaucratic immunization against consequence by attributing their patience to a metaphysical authority. Their monopoly on knowledge of the Force could not be cross-examined. The Council masked institutional risk management as theology. Revan saw through this architecture almost immediately. While the Council sat safely on Coruscant, classifying the Outer Rim as a buffer zone, Revan was studying the grim reality of the front lines. To the Council, the besieged cities of Taris and the orbital platforms of Sirocco were merely variables. Don't get me wrong, the Council members were not monsters, but they had developed something far more insidious than cruelty: principled distance. They possessed the capacity to mourn the devastation of Cathar in the abstract, experience the grief of the Force as a spiritual meditation, and then issue absolutely no orders. For Revan, observing this detachment was radicalizing. Caught between visceral reports of Mandalorian atrocities and the Council's remote communiques, Revan saw an institution that had confused the language of morality with the practice of it. They had mastered the sermon while abandoning the obligation. Revan realized their philosophy had metastasized into a framework for inaction. He looked at an order that believed intervening was a form of spiritual contamination, and he asked a fatal question. If we are the most powerful force for intervention in the galaxy, and we choose to do nothing while civilians are exterminated, what precisely is our purpose? The Council had no answer. Revan, observing the ashes of the Outer Rim, decided the Jedi authority was no longer valid. Revan is often described, in the sanitized records, as a brilliant but unstable Jedi Knight, who could not accept the council's wisdom. That framing reverses the causal chain. He did not turn because he rejected their wisdom. He turned because he discovered there was no wisdom behind their restraint, only fear, procedure, and a theology of distance. On the front lines, Revan encountered a reality the council had carefully curated out of its own archives. He walked the shattered streets of Taris, stepped through the irradiated dust of Sirocco, and listened as survivors described Mandalorian atrocities in detail that never appeared in the council's summaries. Every time he returned to the temple, he found those same events reduced to neutral entries and fluid situations, wrapped in rhetoric about patience and balance. For a time, Revan attempted to operate within the Order's framework. He argued in chambers, presented reports, and proposed limited interventions that would have saved lives without compromising the Council's professed values. What he discovered was that the institution's primary instinct was self-protection. The risk of being seen as aggressive, partisan, or contaminated by war carried more weight than the certainty that civilians would die in their absence. This experience produced a simple but devastating inference. If an order with near unparalleled capacity to intervene chooses inaction as its default posture, then its authority is not moral. It is procedural. It exists to preserve its own continuity, not to safeguard the galaxy. Revan's so-called turn begins here, not with a Sith holocron, not with a sudden lust for power, but with the recognition that obedience to the Council now meant complicity in preventable atrocities. From that moment, his question was no longer whether he should obey the Jedi, but whether the Jedi deserved obedience at all.
At this point, the traditional narrative insists that Revan fell.
What it refuses to acknowledge is that something had already fallen long before: the Jedi Order's claim to moral authority. When an institution with the capacity to stop a genocide chooses repeatedly to let it run its course, the burden of proof shifts. The question is no longer why one Jedi broke ranks, but why more did not. From the perspective of the Outer Rim, Revan's decision to act was not a betrayal. It was a reallocation of trust. Worlds that had been quietly designated as expendable buffer zones suddenly found themselves defended by a commander who treated their survival as non-negotiable. The Republic's official histories call this arrogance. The survivors tended to call it arrival. None of this is to suggest that every choice Revan made thereafter was just or clean. The use of the mass shadow generator at Malachor V, the later authoritarian structures of his own empire, these are not absolved by the Council's cowardice. But if we analyze his trajectory honestly, we find that the axis of his so-called fall runs through a single consistent principle. He refused to accept that neutrality in the face of extermination was a virtue. This reframing has consequences beyond Revan. If the Order's restraint during the Mandalorian Wars is revealed as systemic cowardice, then much of the Republic's later history looks different. The rise of figures like Darth Revan, Darth Traya, and even Darth Sidious ceases to be a sequence of inexplicable anomalies and begins to resemble a pattern of responses to an institution that repeatedly abdicated its responsibilities. In future sessions, we will examine how this pattern unfolds at Malachor, on Ruusan, in the Senate itself. For now, it is enough to state the paradigm shift clearly. Revan's fall did not rupture a healthy order. It exposed an order whose architecture of cowardice had already hollowed it out from within.